Hi there, I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
I was halfway through my coffee when my sister laughed and said, "She can't even boil an egg." Everyone laughed. My mom, my uncle, even Nora from next door. I just smiled, the way I always do when they try to knock me down with a joke disguised as love. But then Grandpa looked up, cut right through the laughter, and said, "Which is why she owns a Michelin-Starred restaurant." That was the moment her smile dropped, and brunch turned into blood sport. I always hated brunch at my mother's house. Not because the food was bad, though let's be honest, her obsession with kale quiches and rubbery turkey bacon had long since passed the threshold of edible, but because of the performance it demanded from all of us. A stage set with beige linens, mismatched coffee mugs, pretending to be quirky, and familial roles we were expected to play like clockwork. My sister Lauren, as usual, was the star, loud, polished, confident in a way that often came off more like condescension than charm. She'd walk in like she owned the place, kiss everyone on the cheek with exaggerated sweetness, and start talking before anyone else had even sat down. I always came a few minutes late on purpose, not out of rebellion, but simply because I needed to emotionally brace myself for what was about to unfold. That Sunday was no different. The late spring air was thick with humidity, and the back patio buzzed with conversation and the occasional slap of a hand against a mosquito-bitten thigh. I sat at the far end of the table, as I usually did, tucked beside Uncle Mike, who had already poured what he claimed was just a splash of whiskey into his orange juice. Lauren was in rare form, bragging about her latest home renovation, new quartz counters, custom shaker cabinets, and some Italian stove she couldn't pronounce the name of, but insisted everyone in Europe uses. My mother was hanging on her every word, nodding like a bobblehead and laughing at things that weren't even jokes. I was halfway through my second cup of lukewarm coffee when it happened. Lauren, with that smirk she always had when she was about to twist the knife, turned toward me and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Sarah once burned ramen noodles in college. You guys remember that? She can't even boil an egg without setting off the smoke alarm." Then she laughed, loud, theatrical, as if she'd just delivered the punchline of a stand-up routine. A few others chuckled out of habit. My mom laughed the hardest, of course, tilting her head back with that dramatic flair she used when she thought she was being charming. Tyler, Lauren's husband, gave an awkward little chuckle and glanced at me with a sort of pity I didn't ask for. I didn't laugh. I didn't even smile. I just stared down at the plate in front of me, pushing a piece of melon around with my fork. I'd heard this joke before, dozens of times. Different versions, same message. Sarah the screw-up, Sarah the dreamer, Sarah the girl who couldn't cook to save her life and never quite lived up to her potential. It was an old record they liked to play every time we gathered, scratching it a little more with each replay, never realizing that maybe, just maybe, the track had changed a long time ago. And they were just too lazy to flip the side. The silence that followed was short but loud. You could feel it, heavy and awkward, like someone had just spilled wine on a white carpet. And that's when Grandpa Joe spoke, his voice low but clear, carrying the weight of truth in a way that made everyone else sound like background noise. He didn't even look at me when he said it. His eyes were fixed squarely on Lauren, calm and unwavering. "Which is why," he said, pausing just long enough to make sure no one missed a word, "she owns a Michelin-starred restaurant." For a moment, no one said anything. It was like time stalled. You could practically hear the gears grinding in Lauren's head as she tried to process the words, as if she'd misheard him or thought he was joking. My mother's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Nora blinked, then turned to me like she was seeing me for the first time. Tyler coughed awkwardly. Even Uncle Mike set down his glass. And then there was Lauren, her smile gone, her carefully curated mask slipping just enough to reveal the flicker of panic behind her eyes. She tried to recover. "Wait, what?" she said, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "Grandpa, are you serious? Sarah?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Grandpa Joe just nodded slowly, his hands folded in front of him, like a man who'd been holding a royal flush this entire time, and finally decided to lay it down. Michelin-Starred. Not an Instagram page, not a food truck, a full-service, reservation-only, 3 months waiting list kind of place. Been open 4 years. You'd know that if you paid attention to anything besides your Pinterest boards. It was brutal, and it was beautiful. The look on Lauren's face was almost comical in its confusion. She was caught somewhere between disbelief and offense, like she'd just discovered her little sister had been moonlighting as a CIA operative or had married a billionaire in secret. My mother opened her mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. Nora actually dropped her mimosa. I hadn't planned for this. I never wanted this moment. Not like this. Not in front of everyone. I had chosen to keep my life private, not out of shame, but because I knew what kind of reaction I'd get if I ever did decide to share it. I didn't need their validation. I never did. But hearing it come from Grandpa, of all people, hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Because he knew. He'd always known. He'd followed my journey quietly, never pushing, never asking questions he knew I wouldn't answer. He saw what I built, and he respected it in a way no one else at that table ever had. Lauren's voice finally broke the silence. "Why wouldn't you tell anyone?" she asked, sounding more accusatory than curious. I looked at her for the first time that morning, locking eyes with the woman who had spent a lifetime trying to shrink me. And I said calmly, without an ounce of anger, "Because I didn't need to." And that was the truth. The table remained silent after that. Conversations fizzled out, and the brunch that had begun with so much noise slowly dissolved into awkward chewing and sideways glances. Lauren avoided my gaze. My mother kept trying to change the subject, but even she couldn't find her footing anymore. It was like a curtain had been pulled back, and everyone had to sit there and stare at the truth they'd ignored for so long. But here's the thing, that was just the beginning. They thought the biggest shock was that I'd succeeded. They had no idea what came next. When people talk about success, they like to imagine it came with a roadmap, or at the very least, a mentor, who handed out golden keys and whispered secrets of the trade at just the right moment. But the truth is often dirtier, lonelier, and far less romantic than anyone cares to admit. And in my case, the journey that ended with a Michelin star started in the cramped, yellow-tiled kitchen of a greasy diner on the edge of a dying highway town, where the fryers hissed louder than the customers spoke, and my hands bled more often than they held anything close to elegance. But before the kitchen, there was the burn. I was 19 when I scorched that damn pot of ramen Lauren loved to mock so much, drunk off cheap wine, sleep-deprived from midterms, and already halfway out the door of a life I had no intention of returning to. She told that story for years, always with the same punchline, like it was her crown jewel of proof that I was domestically hopeless, laughably incompetent, a walking warning sign of what happens when a girl has her head too far in the clouds to check the stove. What she never mentioned, and what no one ever asked, was why I was alone that night, in a dorm where no one knew my name, hungry in a way that went beyond food, staring at that bubbling water like it might tell me who I was supposed to be if I just looked long enough. The truth is, I didn't leave home because I was rebellious or dramatic or chasing some adolescent fantasy of culinary grandeur. I left because I was suffocating under the weight of being the wrong daughter, the invisible one. The background noise to Lauren's constant spotlight. Every holiday, every family dinner, every casual gathering turned into a subtle reminder that she was the trophy child. Class president, real estate darling, the kind of person who made ordinary things look extraordinary just by saying them loud enough. I, on the other hand, was the experiment gone wrong, the one who couldn't stay in a major for more than a semester, who wore secondhand jeans and scribbled in notebooks instead of networking. My mother once told me, straight-faced and without malice, that some kids just take longer to figure it out, and then added, "That's okay, honey. Lauren can help you when she's settled." Help me. The phrase made me nauseous even now. But I didn't burn ramen because I couldn't cook. I burned it because I wasn't supposed to care about cooking at all. It was never meant to matter. I was meant to study accounting or marketing, or something you could put on a resume that would make my mother nod approvingly at brunches. Cooking wasn't a career, it was a hobby, or worse, a fallback. Except it never felt that way to me. Food spoke when I couldn't. It gave shape to emotions I didn't know how to articulate. I wasn't trying to make masterpieces. I was trying to survive. So I took a job at Eddie's Diner, where the grease clung to your clothes and the air smelled like burnt onions and disappointment. And I worked 16-hour shifts that paid just enough to keep me in a shoebox apartment with a leaking pipe and a view of nothing. I made scrambled eggs for truckers at 4 a.m, washed dishes until my knuckles split, and took every screaming ticket from the line cook like it was a lesson in humiliation I'd been waiting my whole life to learn. And slowly, so slowly, I didn't even realize it was happening. I got better. I learned to move with the rhythm of a kitchen, to hear the unspoken language of metal pans clanging and oil spitting and orders shouted in shorthand code. I learned to burn without breaking. One night after the closing shift, I stayed behind to experiment. Eddie had given me keys after I pulled a double for someone who bailed mid-rush, and I used the quiet to make a lemon thyme chicken I'd seen in a torn-up Bon Appetit magazine I fished out of the break room trash. I plated it like I was on television, even though no one would ever see it, and ate alone at a table covered in sticky syrup residue and ketchup smears. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And then came Marco. He walked in one evening during a lull, ordered nothing but coffee, and sat at the counter reading a small notebook like it held the cure to death. I didn't know it then, but he was the executive chef of a rising restaurant in the city. One of those moody industrial places where reservations were harder to get than concert tickets, and the lighting was always just dim enough to make everyone look attractive. He watched me make a grilled cheese for a hungover college kid, then asked if I'd ever considered culinary school. I laughed, hard. Then I told him I could barely afford toilet paper, let alone tuition. He gave me his card and said, "Come by the kitchen sometime. Real kitchens don't care about resumes. They care about fire." That sentence stayed with me. Over the next 6 years, I didn't just learn to cook, I learned to lead. I climbed every rung of a ladder no one believed I could even touch. From prep cook to line cook, sous chef to head chef. And then finally, the biggest risk of all, my own restaurant, a converted warehouse with an open concept kitchen and no sign out front. Just a small golden fork etched on the door. I named it Ghosts. A nod to every laugh, every eye roll, every invisible bruise I'd collected from people who never expected me to be anything more than the girl who burned noodles. I didn't advertise, I didn't call home, I didn't need to. The food spoke for itself. And it screamed. Michelin came 2 years later, quiet and sudden like most miracles. And I cried alone in the walk-in fridge for 20 minutes because it didn't feel real. But it was as it is. So when Lauren asked at brunch, "Why wouldn't you tell anyone?" The better question, the one that hung in the air, unspoken and dangerous, was, why would I? What did I owe them? They had spent their lives writing my narrative in pencil, expecting me to erase and conform. I had rewritten mine in fire. And the thing about fire is, it remembers. The thing about silence is that it creates space, sometimes healing, sometimes dangerous. And in our family, silence was never neutral. It was weaponized, wrapped in a smile, delivered through a backhanded compliment or a long pause before a change of subject that said everything louder than words ever could. So when the brunch finally splintered into small, uncomfortable conversations, and the clinking of utensils filled the dead air left behind by Grandpa's reveal, I knew, without needing to glance across the table, that my mother was simmering. Not boiling over, she wasn't that kind of woman, but low, steady heat, the kind that scorches a pan before you smell the smoke. She didn't say much until after everyone left. Lauren made a flimsy excuse about needing to pick up something from the store and left with Tyler, her lips tight, her heels clipping the patio stones with an urgency that betrayed her bruised ego. Uncle Mike wandered off toward the front lawn to smoke something he claimed was legal in half the states. Grandpa Joe sat quietly, sipping his third cup of lukewarm coffee, nodding every now and then at nothing in particular, his eyes still sharp beneath the drooping lids. And then there was my mother, stacking dishes with too much force, her shoulders stiff, her lips pressed together in that tight line I remembered from my teenage years, the one that always preceded a lecture masked as concern. I offered to help with the dishes, not out of obligation, but because I knew what was coming, and I preferred to face it standing with my hands full, rather than sitting at the table like a target. She didn't look at me when she finally spoke, just kept scrubbing a serving tray with unnecessary aggression, the steel wool shrieking against the pan like it had personally insulted her. "You know," she began, her voice deceptively light, "it wouldn't have killed you to share your news in a normal way. A little heads up maybe, a phone call." She paused to rinse the tray, then set it down with a clatter. "Instead of letting your grandfather turn brunch into some kind of spectacle." I didn't respond immediately. I rinsed a plate, wiped it dry, and placed it in the rack, giving her space to walk back her tone. But she didn't. She rarely did. When I finally spoke, I made sure my voice was calm, even, without the bite I knew would only harden her. I didn't ask him to say anything. I wasn't planning to bring it up at all. She turned then, finally looking at me, eyes narrowed with a mixture of disbelief and accusation. "That's exactly the problem, Sarah. You didn't bring it up. You let him drop it like a bomb. You let us all sit there looking like fools. Your sister—" "My sister," I interrupted, unable to stop myself this time, "mocked me, again, in front of everyone, like she always does. And you laughed, like you always do. So forgive me if I didn't think I owed this family an announcement." Her mouth opened, then closed. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd realize what she'd said, what she'd done for years without realizing or acknowledging. But instead, she pivoted, like she always did when cornered, wrapping herself in the threadbare blanket of her own version of history. "You've always been so private," she said, choosing her words carefully, "so distant. It's not easy, Sarah, trying to understand you when you don't let anyone in. Lauren's never been afraid to share her life. That's why we've always been closer. She includes us." I almost laughed, but the sound got caught in my throat. "She includes you because she performs for you. Every holiday card, every Facebook post, every home tour, she curates her life for your approval, and you eat it up." I was never going to win that competition, Mom, because I wasn't playing. Her expression shifted, softening around the edges, but not out of empathy, more like pity, that same subtle pity she used when I brought home B-minuses or chose to spend prom night with a book instead of a boy. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, that awful phrase that always sounded like a warning disguised as love. "You've always misunderstood things. We never wanted you to be someone else. We just wanted you to be happy." "And you assumed I wasn't," I replied, drying my hands with the dish towel and setting it down with finality, "because I didn't fit your version of it." The silence that followed wasn't the weaponized kind. It was just empty, exhausted, like we had both spent years building sandcastles of misunderstanding and finally watched the tide take them out. She turned back to the sink, scrubbing less vigorously now, the steam fogging the lower half of the window in front of her. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought we'd both just retreat to our corners like we always did, bruised but breathing. But then she said something that froze me in place. "You know," she said, quieter this time, "your sister tried to open a bakery once. Didn't last more than 3 months. She didn't want anyone to know. She cried when she closed it, said she felt like a failure, and I told her she wasn't. I told her at least she tried." I blinked, unsure where this was going, unsure if it was confession or manipulation. "You could have told me," she added, "about your restaurant, about the star. I would have been proud." "You would have made it about you," I said, not cruelly, but honestly. "Like you're doing now." That was the moment she slapped me. Not hard, not violent, but it landed with the weight of everything we had never said, never fixed, never even truly faced. I didn't cry, I didn't flinch. I just looked at her, and for the first time, I think she realized I wasn't a girl who burned ramen anymore. I was a woman who'd walked through fire and come out the other side without needing to be saved. The kitchen was silent again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was hollow. That's when Grandpa Joe appeared in the doorway, cane in one hand, coffee mug in the other, watching us like a man who had seen this kind of quiet war unfold in too many kitchens before. His voice broke the silence like thunder on dry soil. "Enough," he said, eyes on my mother. "You don't get to hit her and play the victim, not today." My mother turned away, suddenly so small, so exposed. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure I meant it, because the slap didn't hurt half as much as the realization that even now, even with the truth out in the open, some people will always prefer the version of the story where they're the heroes, even if they have to edit the facts to fit the role. And I had finally stopped auditioning. There are certain moments in life that hang in the air long after they've passed, moments that don't fade with time, but instead crystallize, as if the air itself remembers the tension, the unspoken words, the brittle energy between people who thought they knew one another but were suddenly confronted with the fact that maybe, after all these years, they were strangers still pretending to play the parts they were cast into by blood and repetition. The slap, the silence, the crack in my mother's voice as she reached for a version of herself she could defend. All of it echoed through the empty kitchen like a ghost rattling its chains. And I stood there not as the daughter, not as the victim, not even as the successful woman with a Michelin star under her belt, but as someone painfully aware of how little those labels meant inside this house, where memory was selective and love had always come with terms and conditions buried deep in fine print. It was Grandpa Joe who cut through the static of that moment with his usual quiet authority, the kind that didn't come from volume or posture, but from years of watching, absorbing, and speaking only when words truly mattered. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch or waver, but the way he said enough, with just that single word, was enough to still the kitchen more effectively than any shout could have. My mother didn't meet his eyes, and neither did I, not right away, because there was something in the room now, a weight, a shift, a reckoning, and neither of us knew what it would mean. Later that afternoon, after the others had long since disappeared, and my mother had retreated upstairs with some vague excuse about needing rest, Grandpa asked me to sit with him on the back porch, where the sun had dipped just low enough to cast everything in that golden, deceptive light that makes even decaying fences and spider-webbed corners look like something out of a postcard. He moved slowly but deliberately, lowering himself into the old wicker chair he favored, the one with a slight lean to the left, and the cushion that had faded from red to a weary pink over the years. He patted the seat next to him, and I obeyed without resistance, partly because I was too emotionally wrung out to argue, and partly because I had always suspected that when Grandpa spoke, truly spoke, it was worth listening. He lit a cigar, despite the protests he'd received for years about his health, and the way he did it, methodically, reverently, like it was a sacred ritual, told me that this was not just a casual conversation we were about to have. He took a long drag, exhaled slowly, and finally, with that gravel-lined voice that had once read me stories about soldiers and storms, he said, "I've been waiting for this to come to the surface for a long damn time." I didn't answer. I wasn't sure I needed to. He continued, "Your mom means well, but meaning well and doing right ain't the same thing. She's been stuck in her own movie for 40 years, cast herself as the matriarch and Lauren as the golden child. And the script hasn't changed since before you were old enough to spell your own name." I looked at him, surprised not so much by what he said, but by how casually he said it, as if he'd just been waiting for someone else to admit it first. "I always knew you were different," he added, glancing at me now, his eyes sharp beneath the drooping lids. "Not broken, not rebellious. Just different. You saw through all of it. You always did." For a moment I wanted to argue, to say that I hadn't always been so perceptive, that I had made mistakes and swallowed lies and played the part of the underachiever more than once. But the truth was, even when I'd been flailing, part of me had always known that the dynamics in our family were twisted, that love was handed out like rations, measured, conditional, and often withheld as punishment for not fitting the mold. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. And even as the words left my mouth, I hated how small they sounded, like the question of a child begging for someone else to have stepped in, to have stood up. "I did," he said calmly, "just not loud enough for you to hear it. I came to your restaurant last year, you know." My heart stuttered. I didn't make a reservation, didn't want special treatment. Sat at the bar like any other old man with a taste for something decent. "You were in the back most of the time, and I figured that was for the best. But I saw what you built. I tasted it. And let me tell you something, Sarah. It was the first time in decades I sat down to a meal and felt like I was eating someone's soul, not just their recipe. That nearly undid me. Not because I needed validation. God knows I had gone too long without it to depend on it now, but because it meant he had seen me without announcing it, had respected my boundaries while still bearing witness, and that kind of quiet loyalty was rarer than love in this family. I didn't want to make a scene today," he added, "but I wasn't going to sit there and let your sister keep carving you up like you were still 19 and lost. You're not, and they need to know that." I stared at the overgrown hedges, the place where the lawn met the edge of the woods, and thought about how long I'd lived in the shadow of people who wanted me to be small, manageable, palatable. And here was this man, in his worn-out cardigan and orthopedic shoes, telling me with complete clarity that I had been seen, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows I had chosen for myself. "Thank you," I said finally, the words fragile but true. He nodded, then said something I'll never forget. "Success doesn't need applause. It doesn't need an audience or a standing ovation. It just needs peace. And from what I can see, you found it. Hell, you built it. That star on your wall, that's for the world. But what you did inside yourself, that's the real win." We sat there until the sun dipped below the trees, and the first hint of evening crept across the patio. He didn't speak again, and I didn't press. The silence between us was full, not empty, honest, restful, the kind of silence this family never had room for. Later, as I stood up to leave and he reached for my hand with a firmness that belied his age, he gave one last piece of advice, delivered with the weight of someone who'd earned the right to say it. "Next time they try to rewrite your story," he said, "hand them a blank page and let them see how much they really know." I smiled, really smiled, the kind that didn't feel like armor or pretense, and walked back into the house, not because I needed to be there, but because I had finally realized I wasn't the same person who used to be afraid of the rooms inside it. And somewhere deep down, I understood that this brunch wasn't the end of the story. It was the turning point. But I had no idea how far the next chapter would go. There are moments in life that don't simply pass through memory like pages in a book, but rather anchor themselves in your bones, echoing not as isolated events, but as culminations of years spent in silence, in misunderstanding, in a quiet rage that builds layer by layer, like sediment beneath a riverbed. And by the time anyone notices the weight of it, it's already too late to pretend it didn't shape the entire landscape. After that brunch, after the slap, after Grandpa's words carved their mark deeper than anyone had anticipated, I didn't say anything else to my mother or Lauren. I didn't send follow-up texts. I didn't return calls. I didn't explain or justify or try to clear the air, because for the first time in my adult life, I had no desire to make other people comfortable at my own expense. I let them sit with it, the knowledge, the discomfort, the silence, and I didn't offer them the familiar bridge back to normalcy they always expected me to build. But 3 days later, Lauren reached out. The text was short, oddly formal, and reeked of rehearsed civility. "We were thinking maybe next month you could host brunch at your place for a change. Would be nice to see your restaurant." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an admission. It was a power play, thinly veiled in politeness, a way for her to crawl out from under the embarrassment by spinning the narrative into something she could control again. By accepting, I would be giving her the opportunity to reframe everything. "See? Look how supportive I am. Look how close we are as a family. But the thing is, I didn't mind the offer. In fact, I welcomed it. Because I wasn't interested in payback born out of bitterness or public humiliation. No, what I wanted was something far more deliberate, far more intimate. I wanted her to finally taste what she had dished out for decades. The flavor of being underestimated, misread, and quietly outplayed. I responded 2 days later with a simple, "Brunch at Ghost's, last Sunday of the month, noon, private seating, my treat. Nothing else. No smiley face. No heart emoji. Just information. An invitation without warmth, a gesture that extended a hand while keeping a knife just beneath the cuff. They arrived 15 minutes early, of course they did. Lauren walked in wearing one of those blazers that cost more than a week's rent, hair too perfect for a casual Sunday, Tyler trailing behind her like a well-trained puppy. My mother wore a floral print she probably thought looked relaxed but screamed effort, and her smile was already cracking at the edges by the time the hostess led them past the other tables, full of real patrons, real food critics, real people who had waited weeks for a seat, into the private dining room at the back, where I'd prepared something that wasn't just a meal but a message. The room was stark but elegant. High ceilings with exposed beams, dim lighting that created intimacy without feeling claustrophobic, and a single long table with 6 chairs, even though there were only 4 of them plus Grandpa Joe, who arrived precisely on time, wearing the same dark blazer he used for funerals and formal dinners, because as he later told me, I figured this was a bit of both. Each place was set with a handwritten menu, no descriptions, just titles. Golden Silence, Inheritance of Ash, Burnt Ends of Childhood, Salted Wounds. Something sweet eventually. They read them aloud, half laughing, half confused, assuming it was some avant-garde chef's idea of clever naming. They didn't realize, not yet, that every course was a story, a confession, a reckoning served on porcelain and garnished with restraint. The first dish was deceptively simple, a single egg, soft-boiled to absolute perfection, nestled on a bed of smoked potato foam, drizzled with saffron butter. A nod, of course, to the joke that started it all, the egg I supposedly couldn't boil. They ate in silence, and I watched their faces carefully. No one commented, not Lauren, not my mother. They didn't dare. The next course arrived under a glass cloche filled with applewood smoke, which, when lifted, revealed seared duck breast glazed in pomegranate reduction, plated with charred shallots and a beet puree shaped like a cracked heart. The dish was rich, complex, and slightly bitter, the kind of flavor that lingers, the kind that leaves you thinking about it long after the plate is cleared. Lauren shifted in her seat, reaching for her wine with a little more urgency than the moment required. My mother's smile began to falter. Between courses, I said nothing. I stood nearby, occasionally chatting with staff. Never intrusive, but never invisible. A specter at the edge of their comfort. A reminder that I wasn't hiding anymore, that I wasn't bending to make them feel safe. When the final savory course arrived, smoked short rib on parsnip mash with a reduction of Cabernet and bone marrow, I stepped forward for the first time. This one, I said casually, is called Forgiveness is Expensive. Takes 12 hours to make. Only served on Sundays. Lauren looked up at me then, really looked. And for the first time in my life, I saw something behind her eyes that wasn't superiority or sarcasm. It was doubt. She didn't know how to play the scene. There were no scripts for when the one you've underestimated stops playing along. Dessert was a trio, a bitter espresso mousse, a tart lemon curd with chili dust, and finally a warm chocolate tart with a center so soft it collapsed under the weight of a spoon. I called it something sweet eventually. As they finished, silence stretched long and taut like a rope about to snap. My mother cleared her throat. "This is remarkable," she said, as if the words tasted unfamiliar. "You've really created something here." I nodded. "I know." She blinked at my tone, at the absence of modesty or gratitude. But I wasn't performing anymore. They left after polite hugs, vague compliments, promises to stay in touch more often. But they didn't ask to come back. They didn't post pictures, and I didn't follow up. As I watched them walk out the front door, their backs stiff, their footsteps careful, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. What I felt was quieter, heavier, more complicated than that. Because revenge, real revenge, isn't loud or dramatic or cruel. It's knowing that you've changed while they stayed the same. It's feeding them truth disguised as fine dining and watching them struggle to swallow it. And as I turned back into my kitchen, the one I built from nothing, the one no one thought I could ever step foot in with pride, I realized that I didn't need them to understand me. I didn't need them to approve, to apologize, or to applaud. I just needed them to know they were never the judges. They were always the guests.